You're listening to Toronto's #1 real estate podcast, powered by Watson Estates. The most successful local real estate investing starts right here, right now. Here's your host, broker, investor, and social media influencer, Bradley Watson.
Good morning, investors. Bradley here from Watson Estates, and you're listening to the largest, fastest growing podcast for Toronto real estate on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. I'm so happy you're here. If you haven't already, make sure you hit the subscribe button, bell for notifications, whatever it takes to not miss a minute, because me as a broker and an investor, I want to know what's been going on in our local market. And so we come and bring that information to you. You're the lucky recipients. And today we have some great stuff. We're going to go into a Toronto.com article, a discussion among a panel of Toronto experts discussing their predictions for the fall real estate market. And then we're going to do a bit more of a deep dive into will Toronto area home prices fall in 2020. We're going to, through conversations here, try and figure out where are there opportunities, and it might give you that golden nugget, that amazing idea to become wealthy in real estate. And I get a lot of questions on YouTube, and one of them happened to fall through the cracks, and I don't know how I missed it because it's so great. This question: is it smart to buy a house or an investment property that's already rented? We're going to talk a little bit about that, my take, and having dealt with tenants and looked at these types of properties, what would I say going into that environment? Well, we're of course going to be talking a bunch about economists today. So how many economists does it take to change a light bulb? 7, plus or minus 10. And if you laid all the economists in the world end to end, they wouldn't reach a conclusion, but we're going to give it our best shot today. What do you say? And so we're going to dive into a Toronto.com article. This is a top article of the day if you look up Toronto real estate on your little Googles. And it's called this: Toronto's top expert casts predictions for the fall real estate market. Now, there is a lot in here. This is juicy. They go through a ton of different panelists. I'm going to name off the panelists for you just to give it some perspective. So we got Odine Eccleston. And the other thing, too, is a lot of these people are contributors to major news sources. So a lot of the names might actually be familiar. So we got Eccleston, the co-founder of Wiltshire Homes. He's a broker of record. As well, Brian Gluckstein, president of Gluckstein Design. We got Michael Kales. He is the president of Harvey Kales Real Estate. Jennifer Keesmaat, the Keesmaat Group. Brad Lamb, a developer, a very famous name in and around Toronto in the condo space. Michelle Romano, she's a dragon on CBC's Dragon's Den, co-founder and president of Clearbank. I don't know how to say that. Benjamin Tal, chief economist, CIBC, also a big name we see. Barry Cohen, Toronto's top agent for sales volume, 3 to 20 million combined since 2012. All that to say, we've got a bunch of economists, and fun fact, economists have predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions. So our odds are looking pretty good. Let's listen to what they have to say. And so the first question they were asked on this panel, now we're going to grab some of the golden nuggets, is give your perspective on the state of the market heading into the fall. Well, Benjamin Tal took the first answer, and you know what I'm going to do here? Because there's so many names, I'm going to try to avoid the names, and I'm just going to give you the overall feel that's coming out of the panel. And hopefully it kind of creates this image of what they're saying. Well, according to a poll, 25% of homeowners are considering buying an additional unit due to low interest rates, and the market is a bit softer. So that's the opportunity they have been waiting for. This person says, or Tal says, I suggest that activity will remain strong in the coming 2 or 3 months. But following this honeymoon period, I see some softening in the pace of economic growth, as the risk of a second wave, along with the fact that the virus will overlap with the flu season, will lead to an increased confusion and thus reduced economic growth. Overall, I see a strong 2 to 3 months followed by a softening in activity during late fall and winter, with a very strong spring 2021. So for the next few months, I'd say this individual is bearish. All right, here we go. Next person. I'm bullish on the real estate market. You'll note that the share of the pie given to ground level housing in the suburbs has grown as people seek sanctuary and access to outdoor space, but I would never bet against the downtown core. I think we'll have a strong fall, and as prices for detached homes rise, buyers will shift their attention to higher density options. Guys, one of the things I want to point out here as I'm going through some of this conversation is I think that seems to be a bit of a theme here. And it's something we've been saying. I haven't heard many, and apparently you got to go to these levels to have people discussing this, but the potential for higher density areas being successful on the tail end of COVID. It seems almost insane to suggest it at this point, because obviously everyone is running hours and hours away from the downtown core. But I'm starting to hear a bit of a theme that might have a flip down the road, which hopefully gives some optimism to some of you guys cooped up in a condo right now and not sure what to do. In terms of the buy and sell side, we will continue to be a seller's market and buyers will continue to bid for homes, and it'll just get worse through the early fall. And of course, the winter will come and things will slow down to the typical winter months, but the market will still be very strong. So this person obviously very bullish. Well, the interesting thing is that it's super hot. Last winter at the Rotman Roundtable, I don't think there was anyone in the panel who was bullish. Everyone was saying anything can happen. And you guys remember back on COVID, this is kind of the consensus. And we'll go through in a little bit what some of those predictions were. They were all over the map. We're not sure what's going to happen with the coronavirus, but there wasn't a single person who said, wait for it, things are going to explode. It's going to get hot. I did suggest the possibility of prices coming up, but I never even said it was going to get hot. So that is kind of a true statement, but the forecasts were all over the map. Economic forecasters assume everything except responsibility. And that once we start weaning ourselves off these very unconventional incentives, we don't know what kind of recalibration is going to take place. So I would love to sit here and say it's hot and it's staying hot, but there are some numbers that don't really make any sense. Thanks for the input. Another economist says leasing and rentals are both way down this year because lots of people are leaving the city for cottages and more space, but it's still too early to know if these indicators for long-term real estate changes. And that's something we've been mapping. That's why I thought that's a very interesting point. I wonder, I think this could be a big risk because we don't really know how that'll plan out. Will the increase in inventory and really the slowdown in the rental space translate to pressures on the buying and selling side? We'll have to wait and see. We will wait and see. And it's happening before our eyes. It's just happening behind the scenes in the LTB. Things that are hard to calculate, things that are hard but once these numbers start to roll out, there will be a very real impact. And we're gonna have to figure out how to calculate that down the road. So they asked them another question. Affordability was a key issue in our last roundtable. Things are not getting any better. What's your take? So this is the question of affordability. Our first speaker, I don't think the current crisis will have a long-term and lasting impact on affordability. All the changes we see now will be short-lived, and by 2022, the market will again witness the issues seen in 2019, mainly lack of supply and strong demand. The other day we were talking about supply is kind of this false narrative that's created. Well, the economists are saying it too. So unless you think they're kind of, working against you and they're part of this big conspiracy, they also agree supply will be a long-lasting issue, of course, leading to a lack of affordability down the road. You could argue that municipalities were back on their heels, so they slowed down the processing of applications, and that will have a ripple effect and impact new supply into 2021. So this idea of condos coming in waves to the market, yes, that happened, but these are pre-established condo sales that were bought and now are hitting the market. But what this will do, and this is such a great point, is that down the road, because everyone thinks there's a pullback here, it's going to work against us in a couple years when the number of construction projects will naturally slow down. The sales, if they slow down, will cause this ripple effect down the road. We don't feel it yet, but we will. We're going to see a response from CMHC investing specifically in affordable housing in the next 2 years, and that will be a legacy and a direct outcome of COVID-19. There's an action item that you'll see from CMHC. We'll get back to those guys in just a minute. Someone here saying affordability is a real issue and it's not going anywhere. Look at all the new homes and condo market. Construction costs, they haven't gone down. Land costs haven't gone down. Government fees, they're not going down. If anything, they'll rise because of the costs associated with COVID. So why would we expect the cost of homes to drop? Good question. In some ways, COVID has made real estate more affordable as it allowed people to broaden their search to areas where they feel like they may have a better quality of life because they do not have to come into the office every day. Back to this question, people moving out to the suburbs or people coming back in. An ongoing theme here. So Brad Lamb, which is a lot of these zingers, there's a lot of zingers here. Any of the zingers you hear, just trust it's from Brad Lamb. He does not, he's not slow to respond. So they asked the question here. The next question is the condo market, with all the cracks, what can we expect here? Because the condo market clearly has a big spotlight on it right now. Well, Brad Lamb, who's big into condos, says this. 2 items are impacting the market here, and one is Airbnb, which is, I think, the less important factor. The most important factor, I think, is that students are not in town. So that's the single biggest thing. There are currently around 6,000 places currently for rent at a time in downtown Toronto or in the central part of Toronto. If students come back, that will get sucked up with 1/10 of the number of students that come to the city. There's a huge need when school is in session for these rental units. But as long as they're not being filled, there's a bit of a problem, but it won't happen. It'll happen very quickly once the doors reopen is what I'm hearing here. And of course, indirectly, this rental space will affect the what he's kind of suggesting is that will have an impact in our overall real estate market, which is my thinking too. Isn't that great insight though? I'll tell you, economists, they're too smart for their own good and not smart enough for anyone else's. There's a point here talking about interest rate I thought was valid as well. We're entering into a world where interest rates don't go up when people take on and governments take on a significant amount of debt. Historically, that's been a disincentive to having too much debt, right? The interest rates naturally will start to skyrocket. You increase the interest rates. But of course, the past 4 months, we've actually seen that election by the Bank of Canada has not happened. In fact, they're making very clear interest rates won't go up, and we're seeing that around the world as well. So what you're saying is that we have a problem, but we also don't have a problem? It's like an economist, right? You got left leg's on fire, right leg's frozen, and then he just says, on average, I'm perfectly fine. Another response to the condo segment. Yes, the condo segment is more fragile now for a few reasons. One, condos did not experience the correction seen in the low rise due to the B20 mortgage stress test. It's true. They actually went up during that time. And in the GTA, we are seeing a relatively strong level of completions, which is what we were going to talk about here, right? Now, this is, again, trailing years of sales. It's kind of rolling out now. Add to that the Airbnb factor and the significant decline in immigration and non-permanent residents, and you see reduced rental demand well into 2021. Within the condo space, I see the high end of the market feeling more of the pain. That was a point as well. And the numbers are still strong. They're just not as crazy strong as they were in years past. That was another respondent. Okay, next question. How do you foresee this issue moving forward, speaking to the long benefited foreign investors and buyers that our market has received, right? We get benefits of foreign investment or people moving in. Well, first response, I think that foreign investment in real estate will in fact rise in the coming year or two, reflecting the situation in Hong Kong. In fact, it's already happening. The situation in the US will also be a positive factor for Canada. So there's a plus. You guys ready for one of the zingers here? Here we go. What I would say is this. I mean, being a relatively intelligent human being, if I was an immigrant in any other country, my number one choice would be Canada. And my number one choice in city would be Toronto. Pure and simple. I love it. Short and sweet. All right, next question. There's a lot of talk about people moving out of the core, right, and into these small towns, formerly cottage-style areas. What have you seen talking to these individuals as far as they're mapping it out? Well, first person says it's here to stay. A lot of my ClearBank employees bought houses during the pandemic, most of them outside the city. It's much nicer to be in an area with nature, more space if you're spending more time. And the data shows sales are up 40% in the GTA compared to the 16% in Toronto. But it's probably too soon to say how many people will move to the suburbs. In other words, you don't really know, but I love this point. We've seen a lot of people leaving San Francisco and New York City because of density and affordability, but Toronto hasn't seen that yet at the same scale. Here's another comment. There's a big narrative right now about people moving out of the city, but if you look at the data, it's actually hot everywhere, which is kind of outstanding. And that's true. As we've looked at the stats for last month, we can see sale prices in Toronto are kicking butt. They really are. But again, this narrative continues. And so are we going to read between the lines or what? Ready for another zinger? Here we go. What is the agenda of the Liberal Party right now? It's a green economy, right? You can't have a green economy living in the suburbs. So it goes counterproductive to what humans are concerned about with global warming and carbon emissions. You can't be concerned about global warming and carbon emissions and then go and flood the suburbs again with people so it destroys the green belt. And here's a big ouchie. Smart humans understand that these are short-term trends. These people who are making these stupid decisions, thinking this is a new normal way of life, they will get stuck in the suburbs and get priced out and be miserable because they're going to have a 2-hour commute with all the other idiots that moved to the 905 when they didn't have to. Ooh, boom. That's rough, man. That's rough. That's blunt. I guess he's getting old. That sounds like an old grandpa, right? That's a grandpa response. Like, oh, damn, you can't say that. Here's another comment. I think it's temporary. Work from home is here to stay, but at some point, prices get too high and buyers revert to more affordable options, typically high-density condominiums. So I'm realizing the only difference between an economist and a confused old man with Alzheimer's is that the economists are holding a calculator. We're all over the map here, and clearly there's no specific direction that's coming out of The Economist, but hopefully some of their main bullet points add some value to your life as it has for mine, and we're going to keep tracking it. And you're going to join us here if you want more fun stuff as we go. All right, let's move on to our next topic here. Will Toronto area home prices fall in 2020? Of course, we listen to The Economist, but we need to listen a little bit more to the stats and maybe reflect back on, though embarrassing, some of the past forecasts that have maybe failed or fallen flat on their face. Well, the most pessimistic forecast came, and this comes from a Move Smartly article, by the way. The most pessimistic forecast came from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the CMHC, which released a forecast back in May, which suggested that, quote, the average MLS price will decline by 9% to 18% from its pre-COVID-19 levels before beginning to recover in the first half of 2021. I still remember making that podcast. That was unbelievable when that happened. I could not believe CMHC was taking such a strong, being the federal government, such a strong stance. Well, they say, while I believe in the value in thinking through the worst case scenario, I thought it would be helpful to take a look at how accurate CMHC's forecast has been to date and to assess the likelihood of a decline in prices by year end as we head into the fall market. I think this is valid. Many of you who follow our podcast channel, you're a little spoiled because you've kind of been kept in the loop as we go. But I'll tell you, I get contacted by people that are either new to the channel or just kind of contacting to ask general questions. And they actually they still hold on to these CMHC forecasts. I see market watches, market news, main legitimate sources still quoting an 18% drop from the CMHC forecast. And I'm over here scratching my head. And so I think it's important to get people caught up and just to remember exactly how bad that calculation was, okay? It's important to note that the CMHC's forecast is more nuanced than many media headlines suggested. The widely reported 18% projected price decline was a national average with variances between different regions, right? So the point of this article is let's look at what they said about just the GTA. Well, they said this: home sales in the Greater Toronto Area will decline for the rest of this year and then start to recover by 2021 Q1 and show growth throughout 2022. Well, we don't need to go far to know that that was wrong. Even if home sales in September see no increase this month, over the last year, the number of sales in Q3 2020 would come to an annually seasonally adjusted volume in the 115,000 range, which is 47% higher than CMHC's optimistic forecast because they gave a range. Way off. Oops. It's more helpful to consider that sales from January to August this year as compared to the same period last year are down still, recognize, from last year to this point to August by just 4%, which suggests that the Toronto market is on track to achieve a similar sales volume to 2019. Love that prediction. Makes sense, right? We're on track to kind of line up with last year as far as sales. Now let's turn to their average home price predictions coming out of CMHC. Way back yonder. Here's what they said. Average home prices were on an upward trajectory during the time period leading up to the provincial lockdown in mid-March. They will decline throughout the remainder of the year and into 2021. Okay, well, for the first 2 months of the third quarter, July and August, that we just kind of came through here, average home prices in the GTA were $954,000, which is 10% above CMHC's forecast and 7% above the average price for a home during the first quarter. So not only did we topple last year's stats, we're beating the best, the pre-COVID top. We've outpaced that. And one of the things they note here is there's definitely skewing happening in the types of home selling because we saw in the second quarter there was a disproportionate number of sales for condos, and all of a sudden it flipped and we see a disproportionate number of sales for low-rise relative to condos. Well, even if we control for the difference in the compositions of home selling this year, average home prices for July and August would still be in the $918,000 range, well above CMHC's forecast and higher than the first quarter. So CMHC, they dove both feet into the pool and they broke their neck. Why? They forgot to seasonally adjust. Okay, here we go. Any way you look at the data, Toronto's housing market, at least for now, is moving in the opposite direction of CMHC's forecast. CMHC predicted a gradual decline, while Toronto's housing market is seeing sales and prices increase. And you've probably heard about that on the news. Normally, it would be unfair to judge any economic forecaster too harshly for its inaccurate forecast during such unprecedented and volatile times, but CMHC took a very strong position when it came to their COVID-19 forecast. In fact, before we get into what some of the other forecasters were saying, he had this tweet. Please question the motivation of anyone who wants, and when I say he, by the way, I mean the CEO of CMHC. This is a tweet. Please question the motivation of anyone who wants you to believe prices will go up. In brackets, yes, up. With our economy in slow motion, oil being given away, millions of Canadians on income support, and a greater percentage of mortgages not being paid than we've seen since the Great Depression. I remember this time frame when this was happening and this happened. I had to defend myself in thinking and being optimistic about our market. So I take it personally a little bit, right? Like we have a conflict of interest, right? Just because we're optimistic about our market and because we happen to be invested and involved in the market. And for many of you who are, even though you're not realtors, if you're invested in the real estate market, that's you too. If you're optimistic about the market, then you have tainted motivations as investors. This was a pointing finger right at us. And so this is why we can be overly critical, in my opinion, of CMHC. Well, what did some of the other forecasts say? Well, let's look at it. So CIBC, Scotiabank were forecasting a slight decline. TREB, the real estate board, was expecting prices to end the year flat, right? Those damn biased realtors, they want a flat market. How dare you? Remax predicted prices will remain stable or possibly see a single digit correction. That was kind of what I was thinking. I was in that camp. I was thinking about 5% increase. That was my kind of prediction at that time. Royal LePage forecasting a modest 1.5% increase for the GTA, while TD had one of the most positive forecasts. It was big news too. And they said the year would end up 8%. Blasphemy! Blasphemy! I'm changing my bank. Well, given they had the most optimistic forecast, one can conclude that Sadal believes that something other than the honest economic analysis was behind it, of course. But interestingly enough, the average home price was up year to date 13%. And TD's forecast was the most accurate, while CMHC is on track to be the least accurate. They were so confident that the house prices would crash, they felt it was critical to tighten unilaterally by themselves to, quote, protect future homebuyers and, quote, tragic prospect of foreclosures. On July 1st, they introduced new changes to the CMHC mortgage insurance, and it wasn't followed by any other lenders or any other insurers at all. Nobody was persuaded, and as a result, the CMHC experienced a drastic decline in revenue and market share. Well, this is further proof that it takes zero economists, apparently, to change a light bulb, because the invisible hand did it for them. And CMHC is paying the consequences of that. Well, here's the final conclusion to this article, based on all of this chaos. Will home prices still rising by double digits and inventory very tight? With home prices still rising by double digits, inventory very tight, it's very unlikely that we'll see average home prices decline in 2020. I mean, it makes sense. Does that go against your worldview? I mean, at this point, I think it's kind of a no-brainer, right? So does this mean if a global pandemic can't slow down Toronto's real estate market, nothing will? Of course not. The road ahead is still a bumpy one, and we hear that, and we've heard that from the economists, and you hear that on our podcast all the time. It's going to be slow, guys. We saw big bumps in immigration. We saw big bumps in employment, but from here on out, it's going to be a bumpy ride. As Manulife Francis Donald would say, I'm more concerned that the cheap credit and a surge in demand will lead to a rapid acceleration in house prices in the near term. Listen to this. Remember our trend, guys, that we're seeing kind of peppered throughout this, which will push prices up higher than they otherwise should be, especially in the outer suburbs. This could make the market more vulnerable to future economic shocks in 2021. So we're creating a further vulnerability. Meanwhile, the condo market, on the other hand, is starting to show signs of cooling. While the condo market is still competitive and prices are still rising, the increase in resale inventory and declining condo rents will be important trends to keep an eye on in the months ahead. There's lots of fear in the condo space, but could we be looking the wrong way right now? Running to the suburbs, is that maybe a possibility? And at the same time, this idea of what we've seen in past, like in 2008, we haven't talked about this in weeks, maybe even a month, but there was back in 2008, if you don't remember, the numbers shot through the roof. They rapidly increased, but then they leveled out again. It was almost like a second crash that they experienced. Could that be underway in our market? Maybe. It's not coming in the next month or two because things just seem to be red hot. It's going to require some kind of change, namely a second wave. I don't know. All right, let's do some hot topics before we get into this question for rentals. Globe and Mail has an article, and it's called this: Potential Buyers Taking a Laneway Lure with Cautious Optimism. The word is out. Laneway housing is becoming more and more exciting for people as it creates additional opportunities, and as the city will need to develop, having that little bit of extra land, making 2 houses for the price of one, not really for the price of one anymore, not a bad idea. But then we're also tracking COVID. Ontario reports 315 new COVID cases, and the big conversation here is that the current limit on social gatherings is 50 people indoors and 100 people outdoors. Well, they say Ontario will lower the limits on social gatherings in a bid to stem a recent increase in COVID cases, specifically Toronto, Peel, and Ottawa. The big question in my mind is, and first of all, how far are we going down? Are we going back to 10? Is that the plan? And will businesses need to close? My expectation right now is no, but we'll see. Cha-ching. Meanwhile, Global News, in their 2 cents, says almost 1/4 of Canadians believe coronavirus warnings from officials are overblown, according to a poll. And polls are a great way of getting public perception, right? Do you know what plumbers, garbage men, and economists all have in common? They all deal with gross domestic product. That's a good one. But a new survey suggests there are Canadians who believe that warnings from public officials about the threat of COVID-19 are vastly overblown. Almost 1/4 of respondents in an online poll made public Tuesday by Ledger and Associates for Canadian Studies say they believe public health and government officials exaggerate in their warnings, including about the need for measures like physical distancing to slow the spread of the pandemic. And the respondents regionally started in Alberta, were more likely to think that this kind of embellishment is happening. But then it was Atlantic Canada, and then it was Quebec, with Ontario at the bottom. Well, I love the title of that article. Think about it. Almost 1/4 of Canadians believe coronavirus warnings from officials are overblown. Could we not have just resaid that and said 77% of Canadians believe it's not overblown? Like, is that not a bigger source of news than the fact that almost like 23% said that it was overblown? Really, the angle on this is rough, right? So nearly 2/3 though of respondents in the survey believe the country is headed back to some form of lockdown similar to what happened in March and April. So the vast majority, despite what the title would kind of trigger you to think, the vast majority of Canadians believe that, one, the response is not overblown, except for young people. Statistically, young people, they seem to be really relaxed. This article talks about as well. And they say between ages 18 to 34 were the most likely to have relaxed on how closely they followed the measures, with nearly 3/4 of them saying they had done so in the past month. They're chilling. They're out there chilling. They be chilling. But meanwhile, the vast majority of Canadians don't think we're overshooting this thing. And 2/3 believe there's going to be closures similar to March and April. The majority. But who really knows? It's the first law of economists. For every economist, there exists an equal and opposite economist. The second law of economists, they're both wrong. And as it relates to interest rates, just yesterday, the US Fed, pledged low rates for years and until inflation picks up. So again, the story continues on the fact that until we can reach higher inflation numbers, don't expect interest rates. We're talking 2023 before interest rates likely, as of right now, are expected to increase. Okay. Last and final question of today, if you stuck around. If you're an investor out there, maybe you're wondering, is it smart to buy a house that is already rented? This comment came from FP on YouTube about a week ago. And here's my thinking on it, okay? So there are some benefits. If you pick up a property, it's got some tenants in it. Number one, you got no lost income because you're assuming them. In fact, even if you get it mid-month, you get the balance forwarded to you if they've kind of paid in advance or however the payments are, it gets all balanced out. You're not going to lose a single month, assuming they're paying. The other nice thing is you can see the history of payments collected. You can request 3 months of bank statements, whatever you want, to get peace and comfort knowing that that tenant has a good history of payments. And also, because these homes don't show as well, it might mean the house is cheaper, right? It might mean you get a bit of a deal on that property. Also, it might mean that if it's a cheaper house if the rents are low. So let's say the market rent right now is $2,000 and you got it and the tenant's only paying $1,700. That is a disincentive to a lot of investors to pick up that property. But if you're willing to eat that $300 or maybe put a little bit more money down to cover that cost to get that positive cash flow, we're talking higher net worth people, you're talking a cheaper house because other people are turning that deal down. Even when I'm analyzing property, we're turning those deals down. We want to make sure we've got a solid cash flow coming in, but if you're willing to take that risk, there's an opportunity for you. Here are some of the downsides. That it's very unlikely, given the increase in recent rents, that tenant is paying the market rent. So you're more likely than not going to see that they're paying below market rents, and you're supposed to have a firm sale document before you can evict. So if you're the one selling that property, it's a pain in the butt because that means you're showing the property with tenants in it. And a tenant property is not ideal for the seller. It could mean that, for example, when you're booking showings, there's 24-hour notice required on showings. That's kind of the rule. That's the rule that they follow at the LTB. And you can't just kick them out and put them new market rate tenants in there too. So I would consult with a paralegal familiar with the LTB. I've heard this question, and I've just, as a rule of thumb, said you can't kick out a tenant because they're paying $1,300 and then put a new tenant in for $2,000. Again, consult in every case. Anytime you're going to approach a rental property, you should have not just a lawyer for closing real estate deals. Is different. Have someone, a paralegal familiar with the landlord-tenant board and the rules there. Also, having a property manager, they are also a very good guide, and they're familiar with the steps. Whether that means you have a property and you need to sell it with tenants, or whether it means you're going into a property, knowing what your property manager is and having them involved in that process might help with easing the transition. It also keeps your face not on your name, not on that document, which obviously having a property manager behind you sets a really good tone with a lot of tenants. And another note, as like a worst case scenario, recognize that yes, you can fill out the proper forms to kick them out because you sold the property, but a difficult tenant could refuse to leave. Not that they're legally allowed to refuse to leave, but they could refuse to leave. And so you need to factor all those things in when you're preparing the offer for that property. Make sure you're familiar. You have an agent. If not our team, you need to make sure you have an agent representing you who is familiar with this environment, and also have a paralegal available to answer any questions. Just good rules of thumb, right? Now, if you are looking for investment properties, I didn't want to pitch it because I thought this would be a better point to kind of mention it. Our audience is growing as far as the number of people receiving these deals, but we go through hours and hours of looking at different properties to find high cash flow properties. Right now, we've been focusing up north in Simcoe, Midland area, but we're going to expand the search at some point. The main thing is here, we want to be within a couple hours of the GTA, a couple hours of Toronto, and get a 15% minimum cash flow. That's been our target. If you want to subscribe to that list, you can find that down in the comments below. If not, hit me up with a message and I'll send you the link and you can kind of jump in. It's really just your name and an email, and we'll keep you in the loop. So as John Kenneth Galbraith said, and everyone was like, who the heck is that? Well, he's a Canadian economist. I thought that was appropriate. We have two classes of forecasters: those who don't know and those who don't know they don't know. Guess you'll need to figure it out yourselves, guys. Obviously, we can listen to these guys all day, all night, till our face turns blue or red or somewhere in the middle, meaning we're more balanced. And yeah, it's up to you. You put your investment dollars where it makes most sense. I'm going to leave it there today. We had a lot of fun. Thanks again for joining us. Make sure you hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you next time. Take care and keep it real.